but I think there is an obvious way in which the meaning crisis is that there is a meaning crisis. I actually don't think it's particularly new. It's just that what's new is that we're really talking about the meaning crisis, that we're like acknowledging it. And I think COVID was a crystallization of that for a couple of reasons. Because, when we're starting to talk about the meaning crisis, what that signals is that we're already part on the way out of the meaning. We're on our way out of it in the sense that there's a kind of change. And I'll elaborate as to what I mean. So there's been a zeitgeist shift for a while. I've called it the conservative zeitgeist, and I say conservative not so much in a political sense, conservative in the sense like traditionalist, a gravitation towards like traditional ideas, traditional values, religion, right, more broadly. And you saw glimpses of this with the rise of New Age spirituality, which I think is a kind of more, for lack of a better term, like schizophrenic sort of
Which for sure we'll discuss because it's
expression of
in
that.
your essay too. Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. And I think like, in COVID there was this phenomenon, a lot of people have called it like mass psychosis. And a good example of this is like you just saw a lot of people get into new age spirituality, and sometimes that can be fine for a lot of people, but some people got it into a way where, you know, they like started believing in like alternate reality basically. And there's various different expressions that this can take. People were like, taking astrology super literally, or they were taking like, prediction scheme tarot cards. Like there's just a million different ways you can take.
Unbelievable. And also, like,
Which
I think
yeah,
empirically you can view it like they've been done polling and stuff where the decline in the trust in the scientific method, this notion of like, okay, we can do studies and like falsify, because the problem is, even if a study comes out, they're like, oh, this has been funded by, I don't know, some elite that controls the world. And so all of this kind of like, in like a like destructive skepticism, let's say.
yeah, and there's that during COVID, because people were just there to sit with the realities and ponder it, and it's the first time they're like there with their thoughts for like an extended period. I think for a lot of people um that's a scary thing, and it's why I like to tell philosophers, but we'll come back to this. This is a bookmark, and I thought about this while I was listening. I feel like philosophers are bad at politics and religion, and like they're not supposed to, because they are different things. But like with every like political work, sorry, every philosophical work, you often see like the conclusion will involve something to do with like tearing with the negative and tearing with the contradictory and tearing with the ambiguity. And it's like, yeah, that's easy for you to say. That's easy for people with like otium and like philosophical training. Or I would just say, if we're going to be honest, like I think there are natural differences. Some people, their strengths are more like in the verbal area. They're more like, existentially intelligent. Some more practically, like there's different kinds of intelligence and abilities people have. I think a lot of people like, and you could say this is partially societal and that we're not encouraged to like think deeply about a lot of stuff. When people are there to sit with their own thoughts, as they did during COVID, I think, part of why you got mass psychosis is because like people like don't want to deal with the negative and deal with contradiction. There's hit with like a lot, and
The
so they just want to
uncertainty.
escape. They just want to escape immediately. And I think part of that is like, I don't think there's a part of that I don't think is new, which is like humans are a pattern seeking species fundamentally. Like religion has always been a feature of human society in some way or form, right? And so there's a craving for that. There's absolutely a craving for that. That's no secret. I think spirituality is fulfills a component that religion fulfills without a lot of the other components. So it fulfills that kind of like meaning crisis only temporarily, but it doesn't really work, because the thing about spirituality is because spirituality is like a subjective relationship of the person. So it's like other people, if you believe this, for example, like I can say I believe in a mixture of pantheistic ideas, and I think the universe is this way, and like I like to read about Sufism here, Buddhism here, and like this is my reality. Okay, all right, so what? Right. It doesn't really matter in terms of if other people, don't believe that. There's nothing that's going to bring you towards other people. And that's kind of what religion does, is it brings you to other people, right? Like
Yeah,
through
yeah.
binding rituals, religiore, and that's what I think people are craving. And it's not a coincidence that I think that COVID, right? You saw like a rise of new age spirituality, which is partially downstream of like a trend that like was already happening since the decline of religion more broadly, like Jameson in postmodernism, the late stage what is it, the latest stage of
Logic of
capitalism,
late stage capitalism. Yeah.
right? He wrote about how in the 80s there was like a huge spike of cults, like massive spike of cults, like it's obviously starting like before that, but you see like a direct relationship between decline of religion, rise of cults, right? Well, I think there is more of that, but more recently you see like a rise of interest in stuff like Catholicism and Orthodox Christianity, and
The
I'm
author
not, I'm not,
bros.
yeah.
And I'm
So
like also like I actually think Orthodox theology is profound, like Saint
very,
Maximus the Confessor, and so I'm not being like cynical about it. I think there's something beautiful there, of course.
yeah. No, I think there's a genuine interest in it, and I think there's a genuine way in which those things will get very big. But the reason why I think people like to dismiss it is because there's often like a LARPy way that it is sometimes embraced, and that's because like a lot of the people who are
Good way
embracing
of
it
putting
are
it.
yeah, like which is people who are by themselves like kind of atomized, who are flirting with it, and kind of they just really like want something, and so they're gravitating to it. But I think it's foolish, like so many of the libs I've seen and leftists who are saying, oh, this rise of new age spirituality is just or this the rise of Christianity is just a total like fad. There's a couple of reasons I don't think it's a fad, even if it takes on LARPy ways. And the reason it takes on LARPy ways is because the people who are taking it on are not part of a broader ancestral tradition of it. Like it's often kids with like parents who either are not religious or, and I say kids, I'm talking really anyone below like 35. Like, so like it's people with parents who are either not that religious or are like religious in a much more liberal way. So they're not really like connected to the traditions. So that's why it takes on a LARPy way. So like sometimes people will get interested. They're like, I'm Cathol maxing or whatever. It's like they're not actually connected to the tradition in a way, but it doesn't mean that the desire for it isn't genuine. I think there's a genuine desire. And one thing, fascinating phenomenon that I've heard documented, among people in both like Orthodox and Catholic circles, and I saw this myself when I was just like out of interest, kind of just checking out the various interests of various churches in my city about like a year or 2 years ago, gradually over that period. And I noticed that the Orthodox and Catholic churches had way more young people than the like liberal, Unitarian churches, United churches. The United churches are like the kind of liberal churches. Some jokingly say the gay churches, right? They're in an effort to be more kind of palatable, like those churches, and the Anglican churches can be like this too. They tend to like, and I understand it, like they want to like be more palatable to like people in the modern day, so they kind of will attract people. But I find funny though, it's actually like older people at these churches, and like the people converting at a high rate to like Orthodox and Catholicism are like young people, like Zoomers. So why is that? And I think it's because people are going to that because they're trying to get away from some of that modern like ideology. Like they're trying to get away from that. And the other thing too is like I think there's a real way in which the material conditions have been changing in such a way that kind of like are making like very like austere Christian values make sense. And this is not like in a positive or a negative way. I'm viewing this almost in the kind of like base superstructure way, which is because this is like not necessarily unequivocally good or bad as a phenomenon. In some ways it's good, in so many ways it's actually bad because it's rationalizing rather than doing, which is a lot of people are just living kind of somewhat austere lives. So like you think about it, like people just aren't going out, they're not drinking as much. Gen Z is drinking way less, they're having way less sex, they're dating way less. They're just like way more austere. Like everyone's just like focusing on work and all that. And we saw glimpses of this with like, the video you found my channel from, the Burnout Society, this kind of like cut yourself off and just like focus on working hard and don't engage in like hedonism, don't engage with um, sex and drinking or whatever. There's a way in which like Christianity now kind of makes way more sense when people are already kind of living these lives, right? So I think there's part of that convergence. And this is why I think like people who think like, oh, there's going to be no Christian revival. Well, I actually think there is going to be a Christian revival. It's just like it's going to be a little bit strange. It's going to be a bit strange in how it manifests. I think it's absolutely going to happen because ideologies tend to become big when the material conditions change in such a way. Like the reason you got feminism emerge, for example, largely like in the 70s and 80s, like in terms of like second wave feminism, then third wave feminism in the 90s, was because of the capital's demand for female integration into the workforce.
More
So
labor. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, labor, and also like a service economy in which women are often like better, like literally better to hire for a lot of the service
Indeed.
jobs.
Indeed.
So you had
Like
like
HR, this kind of jobs, right? Yeah.
yeah, those and like you also have like all these changes where people are becoming more like people are objectively like less in a physiological sense masculine than their generation was before. Like I'm not saying this in terms of necessary, you can view this as necessarily good or bad or whatever. I think it's bad, but like some people can interpret this as good. But it is a fact that like testosterone rates, sperm count, fertility has been declining. And what kind of ideologies do you have? You have like, well, you have a lot of gender dysphoria, and I think it's partially in some ways gender. There's a part of gender dysphoria that's I think natural to all phenomenological experience, as you probably know, given you like Lacan and psychoanalysis and stuff. Like, there's a part of dysphoria that's kind of natural to the human condition. But there's also a way in which I think there's a very real sense in which a lot of people like just don't really like. There's a whole cohort of men, for example, that don't really identify with like traditional masculinity because they're just like physiologically different than their grandpa who was. So this leads to I think ideologies, which is like I think part of LGBTQ ideology and gender theory and stuff, where it's like very convenient. It says, okay, well, actually, gender has never been this way. It's always been, constructed, or and that's very different, than the leap to say like sex is also constructed, the whole other rabbit hole, or and capital. Where has capital play into this? Well, like pharma is what will be solve your problems. Okay, well, you can maybe take these blockers. You can do this surgery. You can kind of deal with that. So my point is just to say that there's always a dialectic in which the dominant ideologies fit with conditions. Now, that can be good or bad depending on like, do ideologies make sense for the conditions, or do they merely rationalize what's happening? Like, do they rationalize what's happening in terms of like, are they celebrating decay as progress, or are they trying to make something that's happening into progress? Christianity, I think, I'm in some sense, I'm kind of optimistic to see like the rise of it, but part of me sees it a little bit like, in some ways, I think it's a lot of people out there who are kind of, like voltels or incels or
Well,
whatever,
can I
who are
pull this thread a
who are
little
kind of
bit?
like using it to rationalize it, and I can't blame them. So it's not like this is a negative thing, but it's partially why I think the revival of religion is very real,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
also at the same time, like it's gonna be weird, like it's gonna be
I
strange.
get what you mean because